Hey, it's MIB. How you doing? Today, I'm going to reach into the far depths of my perceived memory and try to pull out the what I remember about how I first got introduced to Godzilla. This is so tricky. I'm going to do my best, but the time I'm going back to right now is like 6 and younger. Could be like as young as like 4. There's one story I want to tell you, and it's kind of like the context of home media in the 80s, especially like the early and mid 80s. When you heard somebody had a home movie, that movie got a lot of mileage at the time. Like, oh my god, the babysitter has gremlins? Wow, can we watch it? Oh my god, we're gonna watch Gremlins, event time! It was big. It was as big as going to the movie theater, almost. It was, like, right below that. So VHS, it's so hard to see now, but, like, VHS at one point had that level of allure and mystique. And if you had one, it was a big deal. And one VHS tape, I remember, that it was a big deal if you had, more toward the later 80s, was Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Like, that was, like, you have to watch it. If you go to a house and they have a VHS of Pee-wee's Big Adventure, you have to watch it. I don't think I ever owned Pee-wee's Big Adventure on VHS, like as the store-bought copy. I know at some point in the history of my life, I have one of those blank tapes where I taped a bunch of movies off of HBO or whatever, and Pee-wee's Big Adventure was one of them. But I think that came later. So I saw Pee-wee's Big Adventure a lot as a little kid. Like, I can't isolate the first time, but I saw it a lot. And I think it's a safe bet to say that that was my first exposure to Godzilla. So if you're not aware, there's a famous scene at the end of Pee-wee's Big Adventure where he's riding his bike through all these Hollywood sets and he's being chased by Hollywood police. And it's hilarious. It is so funny. And as Pee-wee goes through sets, he kind of like accidentally grabs pieces of it too. So, he passes this like Santa sleigh, and his bike connects to the sleigh somehow, and he starts pulling the sleigh with him. And then he goes into a set where they're filming a Godzilla movie, and it's Godzilla versus King Ghidorah in Hollywood. but it's still clearly a Japanese production. And Godzilla falls into the sled and continues on with the chase. So now Pee-wee's got a sled with Godzilla and Santa. And this was like classic in my head. No matter what I felt about the rest of Pee-wee's Big Adventure, like if I thought there were parts that dragged, as a kid, or if there were parts that were too scary or intense, like I knew it was worth watching to get to the end because I loved that whole segment so much. I didn't know until my adult life that was not done with Toho's permission. Yeah, and that's like a whole thing, like a whole lawsuit, and I guess it's settled. But I think that's my first exposure to Godzilla. But Godzilla as a concept was different than he is now. I think, at least in my bubbles, you thought about classic monsters, and you didn't kind of think of it like, Universal monsters and, Japanese kaiju. You didn't divide it that way. It was just monsters. Like, these are the famous monsters. And it was Dracula, Wolfman, Mummy, King Kong, and Godzilla were in that list. Like, it was Dracula, Mummy, Wolfman, King Kong, Godzilla, Frankenstein's monster. These are the monsters. That's the list. And I understood that before I had any concept that Godzilla was being made in another country, or that all these movies were made in, different decades under different circumstances. I didn't see it like that. I just saw it as like I'm in the world and these are the monsters. So, this is fuzzy. What my first actual Godzilla movie is impossible for me to answer. But the first one I owned was Godzilla versus Megalon. And my mom came home with a VHS tape of it that she bought somewhere and got me. And it had to have been for a reason. It wouldn't have just been some random purchase. I must have been like expressing some kind of interest in Godzilla lately. And this VHS was one of those, the company thought it was public domain releases, so it's this cheap garbage release that she probably paid $1 for anyway. And Godzilla vs. Megalon was my first Godzilla movie that I owned and watched from beginning to end multiple times. And as a little kid watching it, you know, this movie that just kind of goes on and on. The beginning always captivated me. I always thought it was so profound with all the explosions and the narrator like, this is what happened. That always was like, whoa, that's important. And that was the first time I'd see Anguirus. I thought he died as he fell into a hole, and then you don't see him again for the rest of the movie. Watching Godzilla versus Megalon was not easy for a kid like me with a very short attention span, because I still to this day maintain it drags. And it just kind of goes on, and it's weird that there's like no females in the movie. It's like almost kind of creepy. And but it was like, again, it was worth getting through all that just to get to the last fight, the tag team fight. Like everything it took to get to that fight could have been even worse, and I would have done it. And back then you didn't have a concept of like, oh, I could put a movie on just to watch one scene. You know, it was like all or nothing. It's a movie. You gotta watch all or nothing, like you go to a theater. And I loved watching that tag team at the end, and I always would show it to my friends. So think about it though. By this time, I have familiarity with Godzilla, King Ghidorah, Anguirus, Jet Jaguar, Gigan, and Megalon. That's a lot of monsters already. And, you know, they're staying in my memory. Like, I remember them. And it's around here where I have pictures I've started to draw of them. And then I'm very sure the next movie I saw was Godzilla versus Mothra. And this one I think I rented and watched at my dad's. This movie stands out to me because you have to remember I'm a little kid and I'm coming from Godzilla versus Megalon. So in this movie, Godzilla's kind of the bad guy and he loses. And it devastated me as a kid. I hated when he lost. And it was to like these two little worms too. Oh gosh, I took so much offense to that. That was the day Monster Island Buddies was born. No, I just remember that was such whiplash for a kid. And now you add Mothra to the characters I'm familiar with. And it kind of stayed at this for a little while until in my later years when I started purposely watching more movies as they aired on TV and kind of trying to create a mental list of what movies there are and how many of these damn movies there are. Like, that'll come a few years later, but for now, you know, up until age 6, like, that's about what we're at. And that was my first ever exposure into the Big G. Thank you for listening to my babble. New video soon. Bye.